the International Soccer Preview. We are Soccer Files Canada. Welcome to Series 20, the 2023 African Cup. This episode is looking at the players of Angola. Here we go. Hello and welcome to the International Soccer Preview by Soccer Files Canada. I'm Kevin and this is a continuation of Series 20 on the 2023 African Cup played in 2024. We have done a full and short version on the teams, on the groups and teams, and are now looking at the players of each team, this episode covering Angola's players. We're doing this mediacast in two parts. So part one here is a look at the candidates for the squad and their likelihood of making it. Part two will come out when the squad lists are released and the final squad selected. So we think that'll be in early January. And at that time, we'll go back over the list that we compiled today and see who made it and who didn't. And we'll also cover a few other things that I'll talk about at the end of this mediacast. Angola is actually one of the teams not covered in our previous set of podcasts for the 2022 African Cup. They didn't reach that cup, so we didn't do a media cast on their players yet. Consequently, we will be doing a full version of their players here, unlike the updated version that we're doing for teams that were a part of the previous cup. That means we'll be providing biographical data on the careers of the main candidates, especially those who we think will be starters. Before we begin, we will make a brief note on what Soccer Files is doing. We have made a separate video on what we'll be covering over the next 9 months. YouTube watchers can see the link to that on the screen here, and it can also be found in the show notes for both watchers and listeners. In short, we have completed our series on the groups, teams, and players, or at least part one of the players for the 2023 Asian Cup. And now we're focused on the players for the 2023 African Cup, having done also the groups and teams for those groups. Both of those tournaments take place in early 2024. So we will be done the Players podcast by the time that tournament comes around, and also be doing part two. So those two tournaments. We've also started coverage on the World Cup 2026 qualifying. Just started that, but that will be what we turn our attention to after these tournaments are completed. So this episode will have 3 sections. In section 1, we'll give some general information. Section 2 is the main part. We'll go over the candidates and their likelihood of making it to the final squad. And section 3, we'll do a spotlight on the players that we think will be starters. And then we'll do a preview of part 2. So let's begin. And section 1 is just some general information on the team. Oops. Their most recent appearance, Angola didn't make the cup in 2021, but they did make it in 2019. That was the first African Cup that was expanded to 24 teams. Angola didn't make the 2 tournaments prior to that, but from 2006 to 2013, they reached 5 tournaments in a row and actually passed the group stage in 2 of them to reach the quarterfinals there. So a good period for them. Of course, they also reached the World Cup in 2006. So that initiated a good period. We do actually have some of the players, of course, from 2019, but also some of the ones who were in probably the later of those cups, 2012 and 2013, when we meet the players below. Let's take a look at the recent games then. So what we're going to do is look at the players' participation over the past 2 years. However, we won't be looking at all the games, and I'll tell you why as we go along here. So 2022 began with 2 friendlies in March. We won't even say what the teams or the results were except for the major tournaments here. We next had the African Nations Cup qualifying. So qualifying for this cup that we're preparing for. The first two games were in July 2022, and we will say who they met. They were Central African Republic and Madagascar in those two games. Following that, they had the COSAFA Cup. That is the Southern African local group with their local tournament, 3 games there. However, we will not be including those in the count. I will talk about that a little bit later. Nor will we be including their next 4 games, which were the African Nations Championship qualification from July to September 2022. So let me begin there. We don't include those games because to be eligible for that squad, one has to be playing their local football in Africa. And a lot of the first squad for Angola plays their football in Portugal particularly, so wouldn't be eligible for those. So we don't get really a true read. We don't get the information we want out of that cup. For the COSAFA Cup, I'm not really sure what the restrictions are. But we do know that Angola didn't bring their first team to the COSAFA Cup either. And so we won't be including those. We're really focusing on the main players here. So neither of those, or none of those 7 games will be part of our count. However, there were 2 friendlies in November 2022. We do include those. African Nations Championship, well, they did qualify in those 4 games from July to September. And so they played 2 games in the actual tournament in January 2023. We don't count those either. After that, though, in March of 2023, we had a couple of significant games. It was games 3 and 4 of the 6 African Nations Cup qualifying games. These 2 were both against Ghana, home and away. In June 2023, we had 1 friendly before playing the 5th African Nations Cup qualifier, meeting Central African Republic again. Sorry, I'm just going to get rid of some of the graphics here. In July of 2023 was the COSAFA Cup. 3 games there, but again, we're not going to count that in the participation of the players over the period. And then in September 2023, the final game of African Cup qualifying, and this one was against Madagascar. And they finished second in the group, which allowed them to qualify for this cup. They had some friendlies after that, 3 friendlies, 1 in September 2023, 2 in October, and finally in November, World Cup 2026 qualifying began for the African region, and there they met Cape Verde and Mauritius in games that probably acted as a bit of a preparatory for this squad, or that's what one might guess, but I'm not sure Angola used it that way, and I'll tell you when we talk about the formations. So the last part we'll cover here is formations over this period, and generally they used a 4-2-3-1 formation quite consistently, actually, for most of the major games, the qualifying games that we saw there. And just one time, actually, until the end, did they deviate from that with a 4-4-2 in their June game against the Central African Republic. However, in November for the World Cup qualifying games, where again you would kind of expect them to be building their squad for this cup, we found they were quite experimental in those games, especially against, well, in both of them really. And we can see that in the formations, because instead of their usual 4-2-3-1, they had a 3-5-2 against Cape Verde, and a 4-3-2-1, kind of a triangle shape, 4-3-2-1 against Mauritius. So a a little odd there. And we're going to see actually the selection of players was a little odd for those games too. Anyway, that is the end of the kind of introduction. So let's move on to the main part of the media cast here and the candidates for the squad. So we begin with the manager. The manager is Pedro Goncalves. And he doesn't have any experience for international tournaments. In fact, Angola is the first team he has managed, but he has been the manager since 2019. And prior to that, he was with the Angola under-17 teams and the under-20 teams. And then a couple of clubs, Primo de Agosto in Angola, that's probably the biggest club in Angola, and he was manager of the Sporting Lisbon Youth Club for 15 years, from 2000 to 2015. So that is his primary claim to fame. Pedro Goncalves doesn't seem to have played any professional football, and he is 47 years old. Okay, let's move on to the goalkeepers, and first we'll just list the candidates and their likelihood. We have two likely candidates, no definite candidate, but two likely ones. The first one is Neblu, or Adilson Neblu, and his name is in black script because he's been through a tournament, whereas the next candidate, Kadu, like the manager, is in grey script because he has not been through a tournament. Anyway, both of them likely candidates. We have two possible candidates in Antonio Dominique, sometimes called Antonio Signori, and Hugo Marquez, a possible candidate. And then we'll just put on the list Gelson, or Gelson Mangala, as a possible but unlikely candidate. And then a retired player last appearing in November 19th, but a starter in the 2019 African Cup, Tony Kabaka. So they have lost him to retirement from the national team. He is 37 years old, so off the team now. So let's go back and look especially at the main candidates here. So Neblu was actually part of the 2013 African Cup. He was on the roster there, but saw no action. He was a backup keeper. However, he was not selected for the 2019 African Cup. So Neblu is 30 years old, and he's been with the team since 2012 with 22 caps, and he plays for Primeiro de Agosto in Angola. Actually, his second stint with them. He's played his whole career in Angola. Over the past 2 years, he started 8 of their 16 games, and in fact 8 of the last 9 of their games, and was on the bench for 5 and not selected for 3 others. So certainly over the recent period has established himself as the starting keeper, but we have him as a likely candidate for a couple of considerations rather than a definite one. Adilson Neblu. The other likely candidate is Kadu, and Kadu, we will give a bit of a bio on him since he's likely. He's been with the team since 2021 with 3 caps, and he's 29 years old. He plays for Oliveira Hospital in Portugal, and was with Alverca and Oliveirense in Portugal too. Over the past 2 years, he started only 2 of their games, but he was on the bench for 10 and not selected for 4. But he was called up for the last 9 matches and started 1 of them. So we have Kadu as a likely candidate, probably the backup keeper here. Next we have Antonio Dominique, and we won't give the bio on him because he's only at the possible level. He did return after a 2.5-year absence in October 2023 and didn't start any of their 3 remaining games but was on the bench for all three. So kind of coming back into the team recently and a consideration for the cup here. The other possible candidate is Hugo Marquez, and he was actually the starter. I thought he was the starter. Oh, of course, they didn't reach the 2021 African Cup. Okay, Hugo Marquez started 6 of their first 7 games over the past 2 years. So he was the starter at the beginning of the period, on the bench for 1 and not selected for 9 others, including the last 8 matches. So basically lost his starting position over the period. Hugo Marquez was on the squad for the 2012 African Cup, also on the bench for that one, but selected nevertheless. And again, we won't give the bio on him because he actually is possible, probably a little less likely than Antonio Dominique. And then the other players we'll just leave as names, Gelson and Tony Kabaka, and maybe we'll talk about them more in part 2 if they're selected, but their likelihood is quite low. So let's finish by reviewing the list and then reviewing the position itself. So we have 2 likely candidates, Neblu and Kabu, 2 possible candidates in Dominique and Marquez, and then a possible but unlikely candidate in Gelson. So as we said, Marquez was the starting keeper at the beginning of the period. That included the 2 African Cup qualifying matches. But then Neblu took over as the starter. Kadu was a replacement for each of them one time, so does seem to be the backup keeper. But the third string keeper remains competitive among 3 candidates there, Dominique, Marquez and Gelson. Dominique perhaps having the advantage, having played having been selected for the 3 most recent games. So there we have it, and we'll come back to talk about our starter if it's not obvious enough, but our prediction for starter when we get to the spotlight section. But let's move on to defenders here and take a look at our central defenders. So we have 2 definite candidates in Kialonda Gaspar, and sometimes he's called Gaspar. Actually, more often he seems to be called Kialonda. It's the Portuguese tradition of kind of going with a single name, which is usually the first name. However, that's not the case with the next candidate, Jonathan Buatu, or Jonathan Buatu Mananga, commonly known, it seems, as Buatu, also a definite candidate. We have 3 possible candidates in Inacio Miguel, Joaquim Balanga, and Venancio Kukula. 3 possible candidates. 1 possible but unlikely candidate in Danielson. And then 2 players who seem to be off the squad but were veterans, Danny Masunguna and Bastos. I'll just talk about them quickly. Danny Masunguna had 50 caps between 2010 and 2019 and was a starter in the 2019 African Cup. That was the last time he played for the squad, though. Bastos also 54 caps, a similar number of caps, and also a starter in the 2019 African Cup. He continued on after and continued playing for the team until September 2021. That was his last game. But an interesting little detail on him is that he is now playing in Brazil for Botafogo. So he was in Saudi Arabia for a few years there and now has gone over to a pretty big club in Brazil. So that's interesting, but he's not a consideration for this cup. And I might as well dispense with Danielson too. Danielson had 2 caps in 2023, the first of them in November 2022. So he kind of came into the squad, was around for a while, but not selected or not, called up for the last 4 matches. So there is a possibility, but an unlikely, we think it's unlikely that Danielson will be on the squad. Let's go back to the main candidates then and begin with Kialonda Gaspar. and he has been with the team since 2020 with 25 caps and 1 goal. He's 26 years old, and he plays for Estrela Amadora in Portugal since 2022. He started 13 of their 16 games, or the 16 games we're counting, over the past 2 years, and not selected for 3 others. So Kealonda Gaspar really a staple in the defense, in the central defense. He and Buata both, actually. Buata has started 13 of their 16 games also, and not selected for 3 games. So exactly the same record as Kealonda. And so we'll do the bio on Buata too, since he's very likely a starter. He's been with the team since 2014. With 41 caps and 1 goal, and he's 30 years old. He plays for Valenciennes in France since 2022, and has played in various countries, Turkey, Portugal, and Belgium. In fact, he was born in Belgium, so I was going to say his youth club was Belgium, but I actually don't have the information on his youth club. Buatu was part of the squad for the 2019 African Cup. However, he was named to the roster but not put on the field. Yeah, so that is Jonathan Buatu, and we consider him a definite candidate. We don't have any likely candidates, so we'll move on to the 3 possible candidates with a bit of a briefer introduction. Inacio Miguel had returned after an absence in November 2023. So right at the end there, he came back into the squad, having played in 2020, and didn't start either of their games, but was subbed in for 1 and on the bench for 1. So we have him as a possible candidate here. Joaquin Belanga had started 4 of their 16 games from over the past 2 years, subbed in for 2, on the bench for 1, but not selected for 9 matches, including the last 2. So Joaquin Belanga, also a possible candidate. Finally, Venancio Cucula, and he only got 1 appearance actually in September 2023, but it was a start. But he wasn't called up after that. So Venancio Cucula, all 3 of them possible candidates. Let's review the list and then talk about the position. So we have 2 definite candidates in Kealonda and Buatu, and then 3 possible candidates in Inacio Miguel, Joaquin Belanga, and Venancio Cucula, and then 1 possible but unlikely candidate in Danielson. But this is one of the simplest summaries for all the teams because it's almost exclusively Kealonda and Buatu playing in the spots. And sometimes they've been joined by a 3rd central defender, or when they've been replaced, it only happens in friendlies. And the people coming in, it's usually a single appearance. And often it's an out-of-position player too. So there's really no sense in listing them because there's no player who kind of consistently comes in. So there is a danger here, given that they use these 2 players so much, that if one of them were to get injured or become unavailable, the backups would probably lack a bit of experience. So running a bit of a risk there, but a very solid partnership at the back. Okay, let's move on to left backs, and we will start by listing the candidates. So we have Toe Canero, and I usually see him referred to as Canero. We have Toe Canero is a definite candidate. We have Nurio Fortuna as a possible candidate, as well as Anderson Lukoki, also a possible candidate. And then we have 1 possible but unlikely candidate in Peso. So I'll deal with him right away here because he doesn't seem likely. He was a starter actually in the 2019 African Cup, was Peso, and but off the team for a while after that. He returned after a 20-month absence in November 2022, and just subbed in for one game and on the bench for two, and then not selected for the last 9 matches. So he doesn't look like a likely candidate here. So we'll focus our attention on the ones that do, beginning with Carnero, and we'll give a biography of him because he looks like a starter. Carnero has been with the national team since 2017, 32 caps and 1 goal. He's 28 years old, and he plays for another of the big clubs in Angola, Petro Atletico. And he was a candidate for the 2019 African Cup, but really hadn't played for them in the lead up to that very much. His first cap was in 2017, but he really wasn't a big part of the squad, so not selected in short. However, since over the past 2 years, he has started 14 of their 16 games, was on the bench for one and not selected for another. So you can't get a much more definite candidate than that, and that is Carnero, our definite candidate. The two possible candidates, the first of whom is Nurio Fortuna, started 3 of their 16 games over the past 2 years, subbed in for 2. He was out with 4 separate injuries for 9 games, and then not selected for 2 others. So a little hard to tell how he would have done had he not been struggling with injury. But already he's probably a little more than a possible candidate if he's fit. However, he was fielded for the last 2 games, so that's kind of more evidence that they would use him if he's fit. The other one is Anderson Lukoki, and one of my sources has him playing a friendly in 2020, but a couple of others don't. So we'll say that his first appearance was on the bench in October 2022, and he didn't start. Sorry, that must be October 2023, and didn't start any of the 3 remaining games, but was on the bench for 2 of them, but then not selected for the last match in November. But the thing about Anderson Lukoki is his club affiliations are quite good. And he's with Hertha Berlin in Germany since 2023, and with Mainz in Germany before that. He was actually born in Germany. So I wouldn't be surprised to see him coming into the squad. He doesn't have any caps for Angola yet. He's 26 years old, but I wouldn't be surprised actually if he was even selected for this one, or to see him playing a bigger role in the future for Angola. Anyway, let's go over the list again and then summarize the position. So we have Carnero as a definite candidate, Nurio Fortuna and Anderson Lukoki both as possible candidates, and Peso as a possible but unlikely candidate. So let's summarize the position. Quite clearly, Carnero is the starter and Fortuna is the backup. Carnero has gone forward to play as a left winger in the odd formation that they use a 3-man backline in. Those are usually in friendlies. Interestingly, though, he did this on the right side, so moved upfield to play as a right winger in the second last game. And it was central attacking midfielder Freddie, who's all over the field really, playing as the left winger. And then in the final game, they both played on the same side, so Carnero on the right and Freddie on the left as backs. So Carnero a right back and Freddie a left back. As I said, they were strangely experimentative in their first World Cup qualifying games, and we get our first glimpse of that here. Anyway, Carnero as a starter, Fortuna, if he remains healthy, as a backup, but Lukoki seems like a good alternative candidate, either to bring to the cup along with them, or if Fortuna is not gets a fifth injury over the period. Okay, let's move over to the right back position, and we have no definite or likely candidates here. We have just three possible candidates. The first one, Eddie Afonso. I have seen him just listed as Eddie. We have Gigli Ndefe and Lloyd Augusto. And then we have a possible but unlikely candidate in Antonio Rossi. And we'll just make a quick mention of Bruno Gaspar. He was a starter in the 2019 African Cup, but he didn't appear for the national team after that. I was actually introducing him because I thought he was a veteran, but I see he actually only has 4 caps for the team just in 2019. So let's go back to the main candidates here. The first of our possible candidates, Eddie Afonso. We're not going to put any of them in the spotlight here and give the biographical information because none of them seem likely enough to be starters. But Eddie Afonso was part of the 2019 African Cup team on the roster, but saw no action. He had since started 7 of their 16 games, subbed in for 1 and on the bench for 3, and not selected for 5 others. But when we get to the summary, we'll see that most of those starts were early in the period, in the 2-year period that we're talking about. Gigli Ndefe got his first cap in June 2022 and started 3 of their remaining 14 games. He subbed in for 1 and was on the bench for 3 and not selected for 7 matches. However, the last 2 matches were non-selections also, so that puts a bit of a doubt on Gigli Ndefe. He is born in the Netherlands, by the way. And finally, Lloyd Augusto had returned after a more than 2-year absence in June 2023, and he started the last 2 of their remaining 7 games here, and he was subbed in for 1 but not selected for 4 of those 7 games. The 2 games he started, though, were as defensive midfielder, so he's not really a candidate for right back and just a possible candidate to reach the squad here. So let's review. And no, we'll just mention Antonio Rossi. Basically, got his first cap in November 2022, didn't start any games, subbed in for 2 and on the bench for 2, and then not selected for 8 others, including the last 4 matches. So a chance of him being there, but not a likely candidate. Okay, so we have 3 candidates at the possible level: Afonso, Ndefe, and Augusto, and 1 at the possible but unlikely level, Rossi. And in terms of summarizing the position, it's been mostly Eddie Afonso, especially in the African Cup qualifiers. So I think he played 1 at the beginning of the period. Then the African Cup qualifiers were more in the middle of the period. That's where he showed up. Ndefe replaced him a couple of times during that period, and recently Ndefe has been appearing a little bit more. Just once, really, in very recent games. Rather, it's been out of position players playing as right back, including the central defender Buatu, and for the last 2 games, the left back, as we saw, Carnero. So it doesn't seem like they're really satisfied with these candidates, and we'd be surprised if any of them were starters at the right back position. Again, we'll talk about our predictions in the spotlight. Let's move on then from defense to the midfield and begin with defensive midfielders. So let's give you the candidates first. We have no definite candidates, but we have 2 likely candidates in Show. His actual name is Manuel Luis da Silva Cafumana, and he's sometimes called Show, which I've sometimes heard pronounced more like Cho or Chow. Anyway, that is him. And then we have Keolano Manuel, I see him listed more as Kealano than I do as Manuel. He's also a likely candidate. And then we have 4 possible candidates in Bruno Paz, Estrella, Domingos Andrade, and Alem, the 4th of them. And then we have 1 possible but unlikely candidate in Hera Nielsen. We also have a veteran leaving the squad. He was a starter in the 2019 African Cup, but also in the 2010 African Cup, so going quite a ways back there. Stelvio is his name, or Stelvio Rosa de Cruz, and he played for the team from 2009 to 2019. Actually, he's still playing club soccer. But last appeared for Angola in the 2019 African Cup. So he is off the team now. And let's go back and look a bit closer at the main candidates. So Show we'll put him in the spotlight because we think he's a likely starter. He's been with Angola since 2017 and has 35 caps and 1 goal. He's actually just 24 years old. So he must have gotten his first cap when he was 18. I'm just quickly doing the math in my head, and that seems to be the case. He plays for Maccabi Haifa in Israel and was with Ludogorets Razgrad in Bulgaria and Lille in France. And he was a candidate for the 2019 African Cup. He started game 2 and subbed into game 3 during that tournament. And over the past 2 years then for Angola, Show has started 8 of their 16 games, subbed in for 2 and not selected for 6. So he did start the last 4 games. So we have him as a likely candidate to make the squad here. And starting the last 4 games does give him a shot of being a starter. It's actually similar with Kealano Manuel. He started 5 recent games. He got his first appearance on the bench in January 2023 and started, sorry, I made a mistake there, 4 of the last 5 games. And was subbed in for 1, on the bench for 2, and not selected for 4. Those are the remaining 11 games. So Kealano, not as likely, I think, to start as Show will be. He is 20 years old and plays for Estrela Amadora in Portugal there. So Kealano, a likely candidate. The first of our 4 possible candidates is Bruno Paz. He was born in Portugal, and over the past 2 years he got his first cap in March 2023 and started 2 of the remaining 9 games, subbed in for 3 and injured for 1, and not selected for 3 others. He was with Sporting Lisbon in Portugal from 2018 to 2022, but he didn't actually play any games for the senior team and has since moved to Konyaspor in Turkey. That's Bruno Paz, and I shouldn't be giving the full bio on him. Let's move on to Estrella. Estrella has been with the team since 2019 and started 4 of their 16 games over the past 2 years, subbed in for 3 and on the bench for 2, but was not selected for 7 matches, including the last 2. So we'll see. He was a bit more active at the beginning of the period here. Domingos Andrade, our 3rd possible candidate, appeared twice in November 2021 and then was off the team for 2 years, but he came back in October 2023. Didn't start any of the 3 remaining games, but was on the bench for 2 of them, but not selected for the last match. So he is also 20 years old, Domingos Andrade. And the 4th possible candidate is Alem, and he first played for the team in 2016, returned after a 3-year absence in November 2022, and started 3 of their games, subbed in for 1, but not selected for 8 others, including the last 4 matches. So I'm actually thinking that we should put him down to possible but unlikely. That's what I'm going to do. Okay, so the other possible but unlikely is Hera Nielsen, and we won't go into too much detail on him. He actually was a starter in the 2019 African Cup and was called up fairly recently, but not selected for the last 9 matches, Hera Nielsen. So possible, but unlikely. So there we have it, our defensive midfielders. And we'll summarize them a bit later. We're going to do the central midfielders first because those positions are often hard to separate. So let's look at the central midfielders, and we have no definite or likely candidates here. We have possible candidate in Maestro and also in Mario Balbirdia. We have a player, Ari Papel, who is coded as a central midfielder, but we're going to not put him on the list here, but move him to the left wing because that is where he's been playing. In fact, some of my sources have him as coded as a left winger. So we'll probably have to review that maybe after the tournament to see where he plays. We have 2 possible but unlikely candidates in Benny or Benny Mukenda and in Meg, which is short for Miguel. It's Miguel with no L, basically. Or it's Meg. So again, often Portuguese use a nickname or a single name. Okay, let's take a quick look at these candidates. None of them seem like starters, so we don't need to put them in the spotlight. We have Maestro, a possible candidate. He got his first cap in September 2023. Didn't start any of the remaining 5 games, was subbed in for 1 and on the bench for 2. Mario Balbirdia didn't start any of the 16 games from over the past 2 years, but he was subbed in for 2 and on the bench for 4, and that includes the last 3 matches. So maybe he's 1 step ahead of Maestro in terms of his chances. But there were 9 matches that he wasn't selected for. So Mario Balbirdia, a possible candidate. The 2 possible but unlikely candidates, we won't actually give information on unless they come back because I don't want to go on for too long here. So this is now we'll summarize the defensive and central midfielders in one gulp here and then talk about the positions. So for defensive midfielders, we have a likely candidate Show and Chialano, and possible candidates Bruno Paz, Estrella, and Domingos Andrade. Possible but unlikely candidates Allen and Hera Nielsen. For central midfielders, just 2 possible candidates, Maestro and Balbirdia, and 2 possible but unlikely, Benny and Meg. So let's talk about the position as it's played out over the past couple of years. So really it is Show and Freddie, the ubiquitous Freddie, who I think is listed as a central attacking midfielder, but plays all over the field. It has been Show and Freddie for the most part, with Estrella in the mix a bit towards the beginning and Paz in the mix a bit towards the middle. It became a bit chaotic near the end, with several new players thrown into the mix, especially Chialano, and we saw for 2 games the right back Augusto coming into the mix. So we're not sure what's going to happen here. Again, they kind of changed things up a lot in the last 2 games, which confused us. So they could go back to Show and Freddie, which was a strong partnership for a while. However, Chialano seems to be making a decent bid as one of the starters as well. But those would be our 3 main candidates here. Okay, let us talk a little bit about left and right midfielders. So we do see teams or players not really coded that way anymore. However, we do have 1 player coded as a right midfielder who we will cover here. Generally, it's central midfielders who cover the position And it's only really in a 4-3-3 that we have that. And with Angola's 4-2-3-1, we don't really see much call for the left and right midfielders. Anyway, we do have one candidate, one right midfielder at the possible level, and it's Rui Modesto. And Rui Modesto got his first appearance on the bench in June 2023 and started 2 of their remaining 7 games. He was on the bench for 4 games in all and not selected for 1. So selected for 6 out of the last 7. And so we have him as a possible candidate here. He actually played as a central defender in one game. That might have been one of the last 2 games because a lot of weird things happened there. And then he started as a right winger in his other start. So Rui Modesto, a possible candidate. Okay, we are moving on to the, I put him as a left midfielder, but in fact he's coded as a right midfielder. Okay, moving on upfield, we have the title left winger here. I really should change the title because what it really means is the upper left quadrant of the field. So depending on the formation, it could be a left winger, a left attacking midfielder, or possibly even a left forward, these players. But they usually code it as left wingers, even if they play one of those other positions. We have one candidate at the likely level, that's Felicio Milson. He usually goes by Milson as far as I've been able to tell. And we have the central midfielder who we moved, Ari Papel, as a possible candidate here. And that's all we have in terms of candidates. So let's take a bit of a closer look at them. Are we going to put Milson in the spotlight? No, he didn't really start enough games for us to think he's going to be a starter. But we will say that he has appeared, he appeared twice in November 2020 and then was off the team, but returned after a 2.5-year absence in June of 2023. And he actually was fairly heavily involved in there, starting 4 games, 4 of their remaining 7 games, subbed in for 1 and on the bench for 1, and not selected for 1. And even though he's coded as a left winger, he has really started in various positions, so seems to be being used more as a utility player. The other candidate, Ari Papel, is at the possible level. He started 5 of their 16 games over the past 2 years, towards the beginning of the period, I must say. Subbed in for 1 and was not selected for 10 matches, including the last 7 matches. So, but for the fact that he started quite a bit at the beginning of the period, we would have him as a possible but unlikely player. But there is a chance of him making a comeback. So he also is a veteran with the team with 51 caps and 8 goals. So his reputation kind of boosts him up a notch there. Okay, those are the 2 candidates. So Felicio Milson and Ari Papel. And as I said, it was Papel in the first part of the period. But a couple of other players kind of came in and filled in when he wasn't there, especially the right winger Gilberto, who we'll meet soon. And it seems for a while that Milson was kind of settled on in the middle of the period, but that didn't last long. Recently, it's been a variety of out-of-position players, including the right-back Carnero, and as always, Freddie, in the position sometimes. Freddie was the left winger in the second last game, and in the last game it was the forward Mabalulu playing as a left attacking midfielder. So we really can't make a prediction here. No one has played enough that we think they're going to be a starter. Okay, let's move over to the right wing. And an interesting candidate here in the likely Helder Coster. I'll talk about him more, but that may be a familiar name to some, especially Premier League fans, who didn't know that he was an Angola player. We also have a couple of possible candidates. I've mentioned Gilberto because he did start as a left winger. Zito Luvumbo, also possible, and finally Geraldo as a possible player. So 4 candidates to look at here. The first is Helder Costa, and Helder Costa played for Portugal in 2018. He got a goal in his only cap. So I think people familiar with him may think of him as a Portugal player, but he switched his allegiance over to Angola and has played with them since 2021. 12 caps and 1 goal for them. He's 29 years old. And he actually is still on the roster at Leeds United in England, but we haven't seen him in the Premier League for a while. That's because he's been on loan to Al Ittihad in Saudi Arabia and Valencia in Spain. But he also played for Wolverhampton in England, so the Premier League fans may be more familiar with him as a Wolves fan. He came from Benfica before that, and I believe he was born in Portugal, but I don't have it written here. Anyway, over the past 2 years, he had earned a couple of caps in the period in November 2021. That's before the period we're looking at. But in the period, he started 8 of their 16 games, and he was subbed in for 1 and on the bench for 1, and not selected for 6 matches there. So we have Helder Costa as a likely candidate here. The first of the possible candidates is Gilberto, and he got his first cap in November 2022, started 3 of their remaining 12 games, and subbed in for 3 and was on the bench for 3 and not selected for 3. But as we saw, he started as a left winger, I think, a couple of times, so that would be the majority of his starts, and he is 22 years old. The second possible candidate, Zito Luvumbo, and I've seen him listed as both, actually, but more as Luvumbo. And he got he started 4 of the 16 games over the past 2 years. He was on the bench for 1, injured for 2, and not selected for 9 others. However, 2 of his starts were in the last 2 matches, so that maybe bumps up his chances a little bit here. He plays for Cagliari in Italy, and he is 21 years old, Luvumbo. And finally, we have Geraldo. He's more of a veteran, 31 years old with 30 caps, and was part of the African Cup, not only in 2019 where he was a sub, but in 2013 where he was a starter. And he was actually off the team. He returned after a 2-year absence in March 2023 and actually didn't start any games, any of the 9 games since then, but was subbed in for 2. But then not selected for the last 7 matches. So I think I put him as a possible candidate just because his reputation boosts him a little bit. Maybe they'll bring him for his experience, but missing the last 7 matches, not very promising for Geraldo there. So let's go through the list, who we have, and then talk about the position. So a likely candidate in Helder Costa, and then 3 possible candidates, Gilberto, Luvumbo, and probably unlikely Geraldo. In terms of the position, it really has primarily been Helder Costa for the first 2/3 of the period. But recently it's been a string of candidates, really only Luvumbo starting more than once. So it's hard to say. Again, it's a bit odd to be trying out so many candidates as we get closer to the Cup. But that's what they're doing. We would still probably have Helder Costa as the most likely starter at this point, though, because nobody else has really inserted themselves enough to mount a challenge. Okay, let's move on to the forward line, and we begin with attacking midfielders. And here we finally meet Freddie, all over the pitch, but actually coded as a central attacking midfielder. It's kind of funny because even the sources that I use are all over the place with how to code him, and we find I think it's my coding here, central attacking midfielder / defensive midfielder. But even those things he defies by starting as a left winger. I'm just waiting to see him start as a goalkeeper one day. Anyway, Freddie is a definite candidate, Freddie Kulembe. And Mateus Galliano is a veteran who is off the squad. We're just kind of putting him on the list here as a measure of respect. He was part of the 2006 World Cup squad, where they started all three games. Where he started all three games, and has been part of most of their squads ever since. A captain in the 2019 African Cup and a starter there too, and continued all the way to November 2021, where he played his last game. So an amazing career there for Matias Galliano, and 39 years old, so maybe a slight chance of being called up here, but very slim, I would say. Yeah, so anyway, he's not going to be a candidate. So let's focus our attention on Freddie. We'll actually put him in the spotlight because he's almost certainly going to be a starter. Freddie has been with the team since 2014 with 46 caps and 2 goals. He's 33 years old. He plays in Turkey right now and has actually been with 2 Turkish clubs from 2019 until now. And then it was mostly clubs in Portugal, but 1 in the Netherlands. And he actually went back to play in Angola in 2015 and 16 as well. And he played for Portugal underage teams, actually 34 caps and 3 goals for various underage teams in Portugal. He was born in Angola, actually, but seems to have moved to Portugal at a young age. So in terms of tournaments, he was a starter in the 2019 African Cup, and started all 3 games there. And over the past 2 years has started 13 of their 16 games. And he was out with 2 separate injuries, only 2 games though, and not selected for 1 other. So Freddie, or Freddie Kulembe, a definite candidate here. Mateus Galliano, though, we have as a retired from the national team. He's actually not retired from professional football, with a very slim chance of making it. Let's talk about the position, though. The position of central attacking midfielder exists only half the time in the formations that Angola uses. So we do see they use a 4-2-3-1 formation, but have changed that up recently, and in some friendlies experimented with formations, so about half the time. And it's only sometimes Freddie, actually only on 2 occasions was it Freddie, because he's busy playing everywhere else on the field too. So 2 times it was Freddie. More often it was forward Gelson Dalla, who we'll meet soon. So we're not going to nominate a starter for this position because they don't use it really enough to think that someone is going to be a starter. But we probably will nominate Freddie as a starter because he'll start somewhere or another. Okay, and let us move on to forwards and introduce the candidate. So we have a likely candidate in Mabululu, and several possible candidates, the first of whom is Chico Banza, and Mbala Nzola, Gelson Dalla, who we mentioned as an attacking midfielder, Lucas João, Zini, and Miro, all 6 of those possible candidates, and then 2 possible but unlikely candidates besides, who I'll take care of here. Depu is the first of those. He played African Nations Championships matches and was one of the few players brought forward to the main team. But he only started 2 matches, and then he was injured for the last 4. So whatever chance he had seems to have been done in by his injury. But Depu's only 23 years old, so maybe a candidate for the future. The other one is Joe Paciencia, and got his first cap in November 2022, started 1 game and was subbed in for 1, but not selected for 10 matches, including the last 4. So again, we may focus on them a little bit more if they reach the squad, but we have plenty of more likely candidates to focus on here, beginning with Mabululu, and we will put the spotlight on him since he's a potential starter. He's actually 34 years old, so he's been around for a long time, with Angola since 2013. He didn't start any of those games during their good run there, but he was a substitute in the 2019 African Cup and has 24 caps and 6 goals for the national team. So Mabululu plays for Al Ittihad in Egypt, but has mostly played in Angola, although for several teams in Angola over the course of his career. So actually moving to Egypt in 2021 was the first time he stepped out of Angola. I mean, was with a team out of Angola. He was also off the team for a period of 5 years, from 2013 to 18. And he was also off the team prior to November 2022 for 2.5 years, where he returned to start 5 of their remaining 12 games, and he was subbed in for 3 and on the bench for 1. So just actually 3 of those 12 recent matches that he was not selected for. So definitely kind of working his way into the team here. We have him as a likely candidate. The 6 possible candidates we won't put in the spotlight. We'll just kind of talk about their participation that makes us think, or that is the reason why we think they're possible. So Chico Banza returned after more than 5-year absence. It was actually just in the COSAFA Cup that he played in 2018. But he returned in June 2023 and didn't start any games, but was subbed in for 3 and on the bench for 2. So just 1 match that he wasn't selected for there. And Chico Banza, a possible candidate. Next, Mbala Nzolo actually has recently taken a step up in his club career, moving from Trapani, then Spezia in Italy, and then in 2023 moving up to Fiorentina. So that is good for his resume. And he has started 1 of their 16 games over the past 2 years. His first cap was in 2021. And he was subbed in for 2 and not selected for 13 matches, including the last 8 matches. But I think I have him a bit higher on the list here because of that move to Fiorentina. Again, many African teams kind of base their selection on the resume or the club affiliations of the players. So this might kind of improve his likelihood. Next, we have Gelson Dalla, probably a far more likely candidate, actually. And Gelson Dalla was part of the 2019 African Cup squad, and also I don't know what also I was going to say, so I'll just go on to say that he returned after a 19-month absence in June 2022 and started 6 of their remaining 14 games on the bench for 1 and not selected for 7, including the last 2 matches. But I do think Dalla will be selected. He has 15 goals and 37 caps, so a pretty good scoring record for the 27-year-old Gelson Dalla. Next, we have Lucas Joao. I never know how to pronounce Joao. But anyway, Lucas João Alce, he got his first cap in March 2022 and started 4 of their remaining 15 games, subbed in for 1, but not selected for 10, including the last 5 matches, and actually has taken a bit of a drop in his club career too. He was with Sheffield Wednesday for 4 years and then Reading in England for 4 years, but has recently moved to China, often considered a bit of a retirement move there. He also played for Portugal, 2 caps in 2015, Lucas João, but missing the last 5 matches, not really promising for his chances here. Next we have Zini. Zini started 4 of their 16 games over the past 2 years, subbed in for 1 and on the bench for 2, but not selected for 9 others, including the last 2 matches. So Zini playing for AEK Athens B team in Greece since 2023. So that is probably a bit of a move up from Primeiro de Agosto in Angola, even though that is actually a fairly big team in Africa. AEK Athens is probably overall a bigger team. So the 21-year-old Zini, the 5th of our 6 possible candidates, and the last one is even younger, 20-year-old Miro, and he's with Gil Vicente under 23 teams in Portugal, and his first and only appearance was very recently. He was on the bench for their last game in November 2023. So 6 possible candidates there to choose from, and let's summarize them and talk about the positions. So likely candidate Mabululu, and then possible candidates Chico Banza, Mbala Nzola, Gelson Dala, Lucas João, Zini, and Miro. So actually it was Lucas João at the beginning of the period, and then he was the starter in a string of the African Cup qualifying matches. However, since then, it's really been a variety of players. And despite the number of candidates they have here, it's been some out-of-position players too. So Zini and Dala, who we see as forwards here, were among the players brought in, but also right winger Helder Costa and has played there, and the last 2 games actually give us a hint of how unsettled it really is, because it was in the first November game Mabululu alongside right winger Luvumbu, and that was Luvumbu's first tryout as a forward. And then, if my sources are correct, it was defensive midfielder Show starting as the forward in the last game. I couldn't believe that, so I did a little bit more research, and I had a couple of other sources that said Mabululu was the forward and Show was more of an attacking midfielder. But I gotta say, it is my most reliable resource that had Show as the starter there, and given how unsettled it was in the last little while and how unusual those November selections were, I really wouldn't be surprised if it was Show. So anyway, the long and short of it is that there's no clear candidate here. I'd probably say Mabululu is the most likely at this point. I just want to say how many games he started, but he's only started 5 of the most recent 12 games. So I'm not going to confidently say Mabululu as a starter. Anyway, that does bring us to the end of the look at the candidates, and we're going to kind of summarize in a spotlight review where we dare to predict the starters going into the Cup. So let us take a look, and we begin with manager Pedro Goncalves. And we're only going to put him as a likely candidate. It would be late in the game to change the manager, but even though some positions are nailed down, there are several positions which are not, especially at the top of the field, left wing, right wing, and forward line, even the right back position. So He's also a fairly inexperienced manager, so we do think there's a slight possibility of a late stage change there, although, you know, we're not really predicting it, but we have him as a likely rather than definite candidate. At the goalkeeper level, even though we had Meblu as only a likely candidate, on reflection, we think there's no other player who would be the starter, and he looks like the candidate we're actually going to be confident about that and say he's the definite starter as the goalkeeper. Central defense is very clear. It is the two players who have really been the solid force at the back, Kialonda Gaspar, often called Kialonda, and Jonathan Buatu. I usually see him listed as Buatu. We think they are definite candidates at the back. Left back also fairly nailed down with Carnero, usually called Carnero, as a definite candidate there in the left back position. Let me highlight him in green then to show that we're confident about that. Right back position, though, we have no idea. In fact, Carnero came over and played there in the last two games, suggesting that they're not really sure or they're not really happy with any of the right backs that are on the list. So we're not going to put anyone's name there. In central midfield, it's also a bit unclear, but we do have three names that we think will be among the starters or likely starters. That is defensive midfielder Show and newcomer Kielano Manuel, usually listed as Kielano, and then the ubiquitous central attacking midfielder Freddy, who kind of plays all over the field. We're going to put him as a likely candidate here, but later come back to him as a definite candidate for starting somewhere on the field. But those three players, the best chance of being the starters in the central midfield. Left wing and right wing, though, is where we run into trouble. We've had all sorts of players coming in and out, and we're not willing to nominate a candidate for left wing. I said right wing there, but that was a mistake because we are nominating Helder Costa, who looked like a definite candidate in the first 2/3 of the period. We looked over the past 2 years, but recently hasn't been starting there, but still to us seems the best candidate, Helder Costa. For central attacking midfield, well, they don't actually use that position very often, so we think we're going to put Freddy there as a definite starter, but probably not as a central attacking midfielder. Actually, he's only started there twice, but somewhere on the field, Freddy's going to pop up. I wouldn't be surprised to see him in 2 or 3 positions, different positions during the Cup. Finally, with forwards, it's a bit chaotic with a lot of players coming in and out, but the one who seems to pop up the most is Mabululu. Either as a forward or perhaps as a left winger somewhere in the forward line. So we think Mabululu is a likely candidate to be a starter. No great confidence there. All right, that brings us to the end of the Spotlight review, and we continue on with section 3 with our last order of business, previewing part 2 of the Cup. So when we come back for part 2, it'll be after the preliminary and final rosters have been published, so we'll know who was selected, and we'll put that up against the list we created here today and see which candidates made it and which ones didn't. One of our other priorities during that part 2 mediacast is to update the injury situation. So I don't think we saw any lingering injuries hanging over players here. But we want to get closer to the Cup before really talking about injuries and players that might be affected by them. We originally planned to tag on our past, present and future plans for the mediacast, but we have instead decided to put a link to that 10-minute video in the show notes. It covers what we're working on and what we plan to do over the next 9 months. We would like to thank Pixabay and Alexei Ivanov of Mappa Music for the wonderful background music accompanying this mediacast.